Hey there, guys, a very warm welcome to the Holy Shed, which may be the littlest parish in Christendom, but hey, it's well big enough for everyone to squeeze in and find a place, especially you, of course. So, welcome. And guess what? This today is an historic event in the life of the Holy Shed because for the first time in a good bit over 3 years now, we will be taking a short break after today. Finally, after lots of provocations, me and the lovely Pat are going to take off together. Oh, yes, we will definitely be together on a holiday to Scotland later this week. We will definitely pass through Gretna Green, but we did all that a long time ago, you know. So, anyway, there will be no Holy Sheds for the next 2 Sundays. I know, outrageous, isn't it? But there you are. After today, the next Holy Shed will be on the 23rd of July. Now, I can't guarantee that you won't hear from me in between times, but there will be no more sheds until the 23rd. However, there is a soul space this week on Wednesday at 12:30, courtesy of the St Athelburgers Centre for Reconciliation and Peace. Now, if you've never made it to a soul space, why not give it a go? I know not everyone is free for a lunchtime event, but if you can make it, I think you'll love it, actually. And I'll be posting a Zoom link tomorrow on Facebook, and I'll say a bit more about it later on. Okay, so today I am going to return once again to the theme of reinventing God and other modest proposals, which, as you probably know, is the subtitle to my book, The Bad Christians Manifesto. But this week I'm going to make the canvas even bigger as we think about God, the universe, and little old you and me. And in a rather unusual turn of events, I'm going to begin this week with a little visual meditation on perspective. Relax, take a breath, enjoy this little, quite provocative scene setter. Wow, isn't that a quite extraordinary way to bring everything down into perspective? And really makes you think. Now, the sad thing, I think, about the creation accounts in the book of Genesis is that they have, quite unintentionally, I may say, generated the impression that the whole story is about us, human beings. We are the apparent pinnacle of creation, with the world existing as a stage for us, for our story to be enacted and told. And it gives us a picture of us having dominion over everything. Now, after what we've just seen, I don't need to point out the appalling consequences that we have seen of interpreting Genesis this way, because an awful lot of Western civilization has been influenced and based on the Judeo-Christian interpretation of Genesis in the sort of way I've just described. Science, however, offers a completely different perspective, telling us that we human beings are nothing more than something like a dot on a dot on a dot on a dot, because we now know that the universe began somewhere around 13.7 billion years ago. The Earth is 6.5 billion years old, and us humans, we appeared about 200,000 years ago. There's perspective. I mean, this photograph here, this is a remarkable photograph. You've probably never seen anything that looks quite so dull and yet is so exciting. Because this photograph was taken from Voyager 1, which was a rocket that was sent out to basically go right out of our solar system and to keep on sending data back. I don't know where it's up to or if it even exists anymore. It's not the world I live in. But the amazing thing is that this is a picture taken from it as it sped out of the solar system beyond Neptune, about 3.7 billion miles from the sun. Wow. It's a unique picture. We have no other picture that I know of the world from that kind of distance. So where is it? Where are we? Well, we are that pale blue dot to the right of the screen on a sunbeam. That's Earth. That's us. What are human beings that you should be mindful of them? Incredible. Now, I think that possibly one of the saddest things and most ridiculous things about religious fundamentalism is the conflict that it set up between faith and science. And that's especially true in countries like the United States, where the whole creation evolution thing still rages massively, but in other countries too, and to some extent here. As the wonderful Professor Robert Winston said, God and science are essentially two different ways of looking at the same thing, the natural world. Although he says each one of them gives important insights into the nature of the other. So in other words, it's a symbiotic or reciprocal relationship, not an opposition, much less an enmity. It's a friendly relationship, if we allow it to be, to the benefit of both sides. I'd like to return for a moment to a theme I raised early on in the life of the Holy Shed. Some of you have been round for a while will remember this. The distinction between what I call day language and night language. Now, I've done a little diagram to help you to see what I'm talking about here. So day language is the language that we use to describe facts or things which, we believe are objectively or literally real and true, things which are provable. And this is the natural idiom of science. Science and history utterly depend on this day language sort of vision, okay? Because it employs terms which are factual and accurate, and science and history and other sort of areas of life strive to eliminate anything that is not completely provable as being true. Night language on the right-hand side of the screen, however, is the language that we use to describe things which are more subjective, which are less verifiable, and yet nonetheless real for all that. This as I've said, is the natural language of poetry and art and mystery, but also of religion and faith. And to me, faith asserts that mystery isn't necessarily something to be solved in a daylight language sort of way, but something to be experienced and wondered at. That's what night language is about. Now, both of these, night and day languages, can be true, but they're true in different ways. And they're not actually as, in opposition, as it were, as this diagram would suggest. They're not binary, is what I was trying to say. There's a lot of, night language that infiltrates day language. Even science itself uses metaphors enormously in trying to create theories and understand things. And faith, like art, is not entirely devoid of day language, of factual literalness. But broadly speaking, these are two distinct domains, one of which is the natural domain of science, and one is the natural domain of faith, along with other things too. So, historically, Christian fundamentalism was born out of a perceived threat, if you like, from what was coming out of the day language domain. It perceived a threat from modernism, which was going to, with history and science, was going to undermine and question everything about the Christian faith until there was nothing left at all. And that was the sort of paranoia that created fundamentalism, as well as all kinds of other conservative aspects of faith and religion. Now, the interesting thing is that in order to combat modernism and the threat from science and history and so on, what fundamentalism did was to combat that threat by trying to replicate it in reverse. Okay? So in other words, to argue that the language of faith is also literally and scientifically true. So therefore everything in the Bible has to be accurate and correct. It has to live up to scientific expectations, and so on and so forth. And so you end up with hideous sort of things, like people saying that fossils, which would indicate the world was, an old place, been around a very long time. You get people saying that these were sort of just planted there by God to confuse things. This really doesn't work in the cold light of day, as we say. So what they did really, and still do, was end up with ludicrous arguments that Genesis is scientifically true, and doing things like counting up the years in the biblical genealogy in Genesis, so that they could conclude that the earth is just a few thousand years old. Well, the outcome is, instead of proving the Bible to be scientifically and historically true, what this has done is turn the Bible into a laughingstock. And this is the happy hunting ground of, the kind of crusading atheists like Richard Dawkins. It's a sort of sitting target, really, because it's so obviously ridiculous. And here's the thing. Science and faith do not need to be enemies. They actually are friends if we allow them to be. As I quoted, Robert Winstone says, each one gives important insight into the nature of the other. Neither in itself has a total vision of truth. We need both day and night language to live as human beings in this world. So, for me, personally, the marriage of faith and science presents a magnificently exciting source of awe and wonder. Faith makes me cry hallelujah, but so does science. And, I've found that for many years now, cosmology is one of the most awe-inspiring, God-provoking form of insight that has ever entered into our lives. And then we've got people like David Attenborough and Jane Goodall and others who, bring us a scientific perspective which is so awesome and so inspiring that, as I say, it draws a hallelujah from my heart. In 1859, Darwin's Origin of Species presented the theory of biological evolution, and that's a system of understanding human history right back to its prehistoric roots. Now, scientists have expanded that storyline back to the beginning of time, to what we call the Big Bang and the origins of the universe itself. We now understand that the universe is not a settled entity, it's a process. It's less of a thing and more of an event. The cosmos is a story of becoming, of unfolding, of expanding, constantly. And we're part of that becoming, part of the unfolding drama of cosmic evolution. Nothing is a finished entity in the universe. The whole of creation is on a voyage of discovery, and God is part of that voyage. And interestingly, the term Big Bang is itself a metaphor, because there wasn't really an explosion in any sense that we could possibly understand. It wasn't a case of matter exploding out there into empty space. No, it was about space itself expanding very rapidly. A concept which, hey, most of us can't even begin to comprehend. And as the expansion took place, our solar system was formed around 4.6 billion years ago, with the Earth evolving from clouds of dust and gases which were left over from the creation of the Sun, which is the solar of our solar system. In its earliest times, planet Earth was a cauldron of roiling molten rock, mercilessly bombarded with meteorites and other forms of celestial debris. Eventually, after millennia, it cooled and developed an outer crust. The first solid rocks were formed. There were no continents, just a mighty ocean dotted with small islands. Through erosion, sedimentation, and volcanic activity, small continents appeared which grew until they reached roughly their present size around about 2.5 billion years ago. To use different language, we may say, when God established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above, when he established the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters might not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him like a master worker, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always. That's Proverbs chapter 8, and that's a personification of wisdom speaking there, which corresponds to the Greek idea of logos that we have in 1 John. So there's two very different languages that are basically talking about the same thing. So during a gradual mutation taking, somewhere between 200 and 600 million years, life forms evolved from microbes to cells to organisms. And all of that opens up one of the great mysteries of cosmic evolution, which is how it all happened, how lifeless chemicals floating around aimlessly for eons of time suddenly erupted into life. Also, there's the question, was it a one-off occurrence, or did something similar happen elsewhere in the universe? Are there other beings far, far away, gazing across space through telescopes and wondering if there's life over here? Well, we still can't say, although I have to say I find it inconceivable that the voluptuous creator of this verdant little planet, teeming with life, would not also give birth to other equally swarming worlds of existence. Surely we can't be the one and only bright bauble in God's universe. Surely there are other stories, other journeys, other faiths. So it's only in the last 570 million years, if you can get your head around that, that the kind of life forms that we're familiar with began to evolve on Earth, starting with invertebrates and then fish, land plants and forests. Mammals evolved, they say, about 200 million years ago. Homo sapiens appeared a mere 200,000 years ago. Questions about the origins of the universe have puzzled the human imagination from its inception. Where did everything come from? How did creation happen? Why are we here? And so, since science and all the wonderful insight that science has been able to bring us is such a terribly, terribly, terribly recent thing, in the absence of that over the eons of time, where nothing like an account of cosmic beginnings was available, we people, we human Homo sapiens, told stories, creation myths, sacred narratives to explain how the world was formed, where human life began. The creation myth I grew up with is written in the opening chapters of Genesis. Of course, I never thought of it as a myth. I learned it as a child and assumed it to be literally true. That God really did make the world in 6 days, that the human race sprang from 2 ancestors called Adam and Eve, who ate the forbidden fruit and ended up being expelled, and all that stuff. I believed it literally. Of course I did. That's how I was taught. No one told me that other religions, other cultures had their own creation stories, which would naturally appear equally true to them as Genesis did to me. It was only at school, studying biology and hearing about prehistoric animals and fossils and the theory of evolution, that the first doubts began to enter my mind about the factuality of Genesis. I used to go home and tell my dad things that I'd learned in school, and he was very worried indeed. He was, bless his heart, a thoroughgoing fundamentalist Christian, who was frightened at what was being put into his son's head. But even then, it took years for me to unravel the simplistic acceptance of the story that was instilled in me as a child. And on top of that, to find ways to love Genesis and find it to be revelatory in a whole new way. I mean, because lots of people coming to that point that I did of having their doubts basically just throw the whole thing overboard because they can't make any sense of it at all, which is very sad. And it's a big part of why Dave Tomlinson exists, actually, to try to say there are other paths, there are other ways of seeing this, there are other interpretations, there are other traditions. Part of my process of rethinking was the discovery of other creation myths from different parts of the world that fascinated me and still do. Not because I imagine them to be literally true, but because they are such wonderful stories and magnificent repositories of wisdom from those traditions. So when going to Australia and North America and other parts of the world, I've always wanted to go to find what the First Nation people thought, what were the stories that they grew up with. And what I found was some magnificent, wonderful stories in their traditions too, which didn't replace mine, not at all, but which sit there as other narratives that I have to respect. Now, nowadays, the term myth, of course, tends to be taken simply as meaning something that's untrue, maybe even a lie, some would say. But properly speaking, a myth isn't that at all. A myth is basically a literary device. It's a story that is told over and over through successive generations to wrestle with and try to understand or find wisdom about why things are the way they are. It's the domain, a glorious domain of night language. And, their influence has been and still is absolutely enormous. The historian Karen Armstrong says that myths are, and I quote, universal and timeless stories that reflect and shape our lives. She says they explore our desires, our fears, our longings, and provide narratives that remind us what it means to be human. Creation myths, Karen Armstrong says, were never intended to be seen as historically accurate. That just isn't the point. They're not. That really, the whole notion of history and historical accuracy is really itself a very, very modern concept and idea. In ancient cultures, people weren't really concerned with historical fact. It was more about wisdom. A story was true if it offered wisdom, guidance, direction, or enlightenment. And most importantly, a creation myth was seen to be true because it formed part of that people's tradition. It was how they saw things as a community, how they understood the world and themselves. Both and there are two narratives of creation in Genesis. You know that, don't you? In chapter 1, chapter 2 are two distinct ones, and actually they're hundreds of years apart in when they were written. And the first Genesis chapter 1 actually is the later version. The one in chapters 2 and 3 is an earlier version. But they're both written and conceived against a background of Babylonian creation myths, and one in particular called Enuma Elish. We'll look at it sometimes. It's really interesting. But what is clear is that the Hebrew writers contrasted their vision of God with the Babylonian vision, which actually was of many gods. And that's what their story was about. It was trying to place their theology, if you like, their understanding of God out there in contrast to the stories of the surrounding cultures, which were threatening to engulf them at the time when they were being written. But universally, creation stories convey the sense that the earth does not belong to us. That's kind of one of the basic things you find in all creation myths. It conveys the sense that the earth doesn't belong to us, that we're players in a greater drama with an implied accountability for the way we live, for the way we treat the earth and its creatures, for the way we live our lives. Now, science as such doesn't set out to give us that. But that's something that is much more in the realm of faith and religion. The ancient creation myth symbolizes an age of ecological innocence. That's where they all emerged, when humans knew and accepted their place in the web of life, when people worked in partnership with nature instead of treating it as a utility or seeing it as a separate entity in the way in which modern society and modern culture has given to us. For the ancients, the world was a place of magic, a place of enchantment, a place where rocks and trees and rivers and clouds were wondrous and alive, and in many cases were imbibed with spirit, where creation was filled with mystery, spiritedness, which evoked wonder and reverence. When I first watched Carl Sagan's one of the greatest cosmologists of our generation. When I first watched Carl Sagan's TV series Cosmos, back in, I think it was about 1980, I'll tell you the truth, it frightened the crap out of me. Firstly, because it seemed to contradict the faith that I had grown up with. It contradicted a literal interpretation of Genesis. Blew it out of the sky, actually, as it were. And that frightened me. But even more frightening was the fact that I knew that it had to be true. I'd reached a point where I could no longer, deny that, where I could no longer shove all my doubts down into the basement and sort of sit on them, keeping them underneath. But the thing is, I hadn't yet seen, and this is the problem, how I could move forward with this, how I could mesh science, cosmology with my faith. That was a journey that I had to go on, which I've been on ever since, and it delights the flipping pants off me. Now, for me, God is the mysterious presence embedded in every part of the universe. Every part of matter in the material universe is imbued with divinity. That's how I see it. It's a sacramental universe, a universe in which matter mediates divinity. So much so that the process of cosmic biological and human evolution is actually part of the story of God. It's the other book, if you like, which doesn't say Holy Bible on it, and so we don't read it in that way. But I do see God. Yes, I do see God as more than the universe, but I see the universe, or the closest way I can think about it, I see the universe as God's body. And God is the soul of the universe, if you like. And therefore, what happens to the universe, or more importantly or pertinently, what happens to the earth and to little old you and me, in some way happens to God. It impacts God. The joys and the sufferings of the world, our joys and sufferings, are also the joys and sufferings of God. God is utterly part of the world's suffering, and that was specifically and paradigmatically expressed by him becoming part of the suffering of the world through Christ's death and suffering on the cross. So that became the kind of epitomizing point in time of something that I think is eternally true, that God participates in the pain, suffering, and the joys of the universe, of the earth, of little old you and me. So I'm going to finish with a story about a crisp night in Yorkshire, which I'll never forget, when Pat and I left a warm cottage and a blazing log fire to stand in the middle of a frozen field and look up at the starlit sky. Now, in cities like London, where we lived at the time, you don't really get to see the night sky. The sky is awash with artificial light, masking out all but the brightest of stars. But standing in that field, in that valley, 3 miles from the nearest street lamp, the dazzling splendor of the starry heavens hung above us like a vast looming presence, silent and still, scary but awesome and magnificent. And after looking for a few moments, I surrendered to a visceral urge to lie on my back on the hard, frosty earth and just gaze at the Milky Way spread across the sky. Billions of stars merged in a great swathe of freckled light. It almost felt like I was staring into the face of God. And in a way, I think I was. I mean, how could I begin to comprehend the immense distances stretched out before me? Even the nearest star is 4 light years away. 4 light years, which is approximately 24 trillion miles, by the way. The pinprick of light from the galaxy Andromeda, which we can just about detect with the naked eye. The light from Andromeda began its journey to my eye 2.5 million years ago. I can't really take that in. I was literally lying there on the ground in Yorkshire, peering through history across eons of time and space. Little wonder that I shuddered with that same mental vertigo that I first sensed as a child when I lay in bed in the dark trying to imagine eternity. It's too much. The stories, I think, guys, that we desperately need today are stories of belonging to the universe, belonging to the earth, belonging in our bodies. Too much religion alienates us from our own very flesh and blood, and draws us out to aspire to something out there beyond. I think we need stories of belonging to each other, of sensing a common history with the planet, of feeling empathy, with Brother Sun, Sister Moon and Mother Earth, as St. Francis did, of deep realization that what we do to our creaturely kith and kin, the hedgehogs, the birds, the frog, all those creatures out there, we do to ourselves because we all belong together. So by way of a prayer, I've got a little meditation that I put together based on Psalm 8. So just relax, take a breath, and enjoy this. Now, all of this, these past 6 weeks or so, was sparked off by thinking about the pledge that King Charles was required to make to maintain in this country Reformed Protestant religion. And so all of this that I've been talking about in these past 6 or so episodes is me saying, no, I won't do that. Your God is too small. God has to be greater than one tiny expression of Christian faith. Your God's too small. Okay, well, I'm going to drink to that. If you have a drink handy, I invite you to pour it or grab a hold of it now. And I'd just like to propose a toast. A toast to the good earth, to the eyes of love that seek out us amid the immensity of the cosmos and confer upon us, upon little old you and me, value and worth beyond measure. A toast to the future of Mother Earth and a prayer that we will show her and her creatures the care that we are being shown. I'd like to propose a toast to the marriage of science and faith, not foes, but friends. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, religious cranks or atheist cranks. This is a marriage that is worth pursuing. So, yeah, to life, l'chaim. So there we are. After my little rant of today, if you want to support us, you can do so by buying us a coffee. Just follow the link that is on your screen now. It's also always at the top of the posts on the Holy Shed Facebook page, and we are delighted and thrilled by the support that we receive in this way and lots of others. So thank you so much. By the way, you've probably noticed this book here. I'd just like to highlight it because it's a great book. It's called Thank God for Evolution: How the Marriage of Science and Religion Will Transform Your Life and World. It's by Michael Dowd, who began his life as an evangelical Christian and became an evangelist for this very subject. And he's travelled around America and around the world talking about it. And I think, he's a pretty remarkable man. It's a great book. Just thought I'd mention that. So Soul Space on Wednesday at 12:30. I'll post a link for that. And that's just about it, really. Thank you so much for being with me. Have a great week. Have a great couple of weeks while we're not here. Be kind to Mother Nature. Be kind to the world, to people, to yourselves, because we all belong here. Stay human. I'm going to finish, however, with a prayer. Which has just completely disappeared on me. Oh, there it is. Loving God, embodied in our world, we see you in the wonder of a kestrel hovering at the side of the road. Hear your voice in the crashing waves. Taste your sweetness in a fresh, crisp apple. Smell your breath in the bluebell wood. Sense your touch in fresh wind caressing the skin. Thank you for the family of Earth, of which we are a small part, for creaturely relatives, some genetically very close to us, others less so, yet all deeply interwoven by Earth's magnificent web of being. O life-giving breath of creation, may we be loving and responsible kith and kin to our fellow creatures, and honour your presence in each and every one. Amen. Great. Thanks for being here, guys. Have a great week. Have a great couple of weeks, and I'll see you soon. Bye.